Hi, this is Lisa. Welcome to my sewing studio, which in this case is basically my entire house.
So I was pressing this, and one important pressing tool is not your tabby cat. Much. What are you doing, silly girl? She's such a silly baby. Nice crisp press though on this guy. That's nice.
So today I really wanted to focus on the exciting element of trimming. I know a lot of people skip this step. It's a little scary. If you spend any time at all handling extants, you realize that trimming is really important to get this nice, supple effect on this piped seam. When you do a piped seam, you end up with at least four layers of fabric. And even if your fabric is very, very fine, that does mean that you have the potential for bulkiness and for stiffness in that seam. And the reason that we cut this kind of sleeve on the bias is so that it isn't stiff, so it's supple, moves well with the body, and just really does a good job at giving an elegance to the arm in a way that a straight cut sleeve won't always do for this style. And a really important element of that, though, is the dreaded trimming of the seam. Now, in modern making, when we're used to using a serger, this step is kind of done for us. In classical making, where we're, especially when we're hand sewing, there's no serger, and honestly, also, this frequently gets you a better result. So, first, you need your tailor's points. These are my favorite ones. They're made by Geiger, and they are very sharp on one side. They are at what's known as knife edge. So, one side just has this tiny serration on it, which helps it grip the fabric kind of a little bit more aggressively than a smooth trimming style scissor. And what I do is I am showing you the finished sleeve that I already did. And then here is my sleeve that I am bravely going to trim very aggressively into the seam allowance of the pieces that I do not need. So for this specific seam, I am planning to fell it. So I only need one seam allowance, which is the smoother seam allowance, to be as long as possible. In this case, about 3/8 of an inch, a little less than half. I call it a scant half inch. And I'm doing this over a small table with a black placement on it. So you can see, oh, there's Countess, little Countess cameo there. And so I want to specifically take the side of the sleeve that has been slightly gathered, which is the back of the sleeve, and that is the edge I'm going to aggressively trim. Also, the edge of the seam allowance for the actual bias strips that form the piping, I'm going to trim those very aggressively as well. So you'll find when you are first learning to trim, there's a tendency to try to trim it like you would a piece of paper and hold the thin edge towards you and hold the uh, rest of the garment away from you. I actually have found that if you think of it more like you were opening a letter, you don't awkwardly hold a letter so that the main body of it is pointing away from you, and the part that you're trying to cut open is pointing towards you. You tend to, at least I tend to hold the envelope so that the envelope's body is in my hand, and then the actual piece that I want to trim is away from me. Also, sometimes if you've basted, you have to pull your basting out as much as it would be nice to leave it in there. When you're trimming down to that seam, you have to pull your basting out to get to it. And so here I'm just using my quick seam ripper to quickly pull open those basting stitches that I did previously before I laid in the final seam. And just a little bit of extra special care to that piece where the opening of the sleeve is going to be. because I just want to be sure I don't go too far in my unpicking because I want the basting to stay in there for the section that's going to be facing rather than the seam. So now there's my seam allowance that I'm going to trim. I'm pulling back and kind of finger pressing the seam allowance that I am leaving intact. And then I'm going to trim again with the seam allowance kind of facing away from me with the body of the work towards my body. I just find this gives me more control and it just feels more natural for me. Now, if something feels better for you, go ahead and do it like that. But this is just the way that I prefer to do this kind of trimming. And it is always better to go slow and uh, trim with no regrets. Make sure you're catching the actual seam allowance that you want and not the garment. When I first started sewing, a couple times I was kind of trimming in an awkward way and I trimmed straight into my garment. And then for a while, I didn't trim very well. In fact, one of my good friends is always teasing me for the enormous seam allowances I leave in garments as I'm working on them. But now I do, at least when they're finished, I do trim them. And here I'm showing where I am at the very end, where I've got this one line of stitching. Unfortunately for me, in this case, it was white on white, so you can't see it, but I have to stop my trimming somewhere because this piece transitions away from piping into being using the piping as a facing. So that is exactly where I'm going to cut a 90-degree angle and just pull that seam allowance all the way out, leaving that seam allowance intact for the extra little bit of bulk I actually want into the facing. And there's my little trimmed off piece. Um, I'm kind of ridiculous about my trimmings, so I'll immediately throw that away. And now the next piece is kind of at double speed because watching me fell the inside of some seams, not as exciting as it could be, doesn't make for great TV, but I wanted to give um, a little bit of a vibes piece and just sort of have you sit here, me and my sewing buddies, while I work on the insides of this garment. Now you'll notice that I have a lining in here, what we would in modern uh, couture parlance call actually an underlining. But in 18th and 19th century sewing, we usually just call that the lining, although it's being treated as a piece with the rest of the garment fashion pieces as it's being constructed. So the seams end up on the inside where you can reach them so that if you do need to change them later, they're easier to change rather than sandwiching the seams between the two layers of fabric. So here I have again aggressively trimmed the felled piece and I'm going to fell it in. Now, this is a little bit of an extra step compared to many antiques that I've seen. A lot of times those antiques are just raw. They leave these pretty, sometimes quite big seam allowances flapping around inside of the garment. And one of the reasons I choose not to do that in this specific case is that this is honestly kind of silly modern cotton print that I do plan to. I'm not going to throw it into, the washing machine and frequently, but I do want to be able to gently hand wash and machine wring out this garment. And in my experience, quilting cottons, when treated that way, will fray. And I want this garment to be used for many years. I plan to wear it to give ghost tours and to enjoy with my friends and to wear to hug a mom at Pride events, hopefully as early as next June. So um, I want it to be sturdy and with modern fabric and modern ways of caring for garments. That just means I want to be able to gently hand wash it and use the washing machine to pull out the extra water. Um, and in a lot of original garments from pre-washing machine days, even garments that took pretty intense wringing, literal wringing, they wouldn't always have the seams finished. But also, their cotton was grown differently than ours is. Their fabric was woven of different threads with different techniques than we have now. And so, especially when it's just a modern, mass produced kind of, I call it air woven cotton. While it is relatively stable and easy to work with, it's just not, it doesn't hang together as aggressively to itself as a lot of these other older fabrics did. And therefore, it's just best to fell or otherwise finish the seams in the way that works for you. And in my case, this is hand felling, partly because I like the look of it. And if you're careful and your thread matches pretty well and your thread's pretty fine, you can actually make an invisible fell. So in this case, I'm actually really carefully picking up only the underlining when I'm going through to the face fabric so that when the garment is worn, that underlining, that stitching will not show. There are other places in the garment where I will stitch so that it will show on purpose, but in this case, it is specifically being done so it won't show. This is a technique that when I started sewing just seemed really impossible and insane to me. The directions in, couture uh, uh, guidebooks would say, and stitch invisibly to the lining. And I would think to myself, well, how do you even do that? And the secret, honestly, is to use an extremely short and sharp needle. In this case, I'm using a between number 10. And when the needle is very sharp and short, it makes it easier to sort of pick up that one layer. And also, your hands kind of eventually develop the ascertainment to tell how far you're going through. Your free hand or your holding hand under the garment can also give you that little tactile feeling. But here you can see on the inside are my little felling stitches, and on the outside, ta-da, you can see nothing as I intended. So there are other sections in the garment where I'm deliberately using the felling as kind of a pseudo top stitch, but this is not one of those places. Thanks so much for joining me today. Remember to like and subscribe if you had fun and enjoyed my Vanna White impression as I show you my glorious little tailor's points.